Hello everyone, welcome to this week's Harbour Midweek Mini. I hope you're all well. We're on part 2 of a look at the visions of Zechariah. And I forgot to mention last week that if you go to the link below, you can watch a reading of Zechariah, and we've put the first 2 chapters of Zechariah up there, read beautifully by Ollie. And it's probably worth doing that before really looking at these visions in detail. I just wanted to make one incidental point, one thing from last week which I didn't really address, and that was the question about whether Zechariah did indeed travel to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel, under Zerubbabel's leadership. If you remember, I said that there were 3 and potentially 4 Alias returns to Jerusalem after the decree of Cyrus. And Zechariah's name, there's a number of lists of those that did go back, and Zechariah's name never features. But if you look at Nehemiah 12 in verse 4, it does list Iddo. And Iddo, of course, was Zechariah's grandfather. So the chances are Zechariah went back to Jerusalem with Iddo, with his grandfather. His father isn't mentioned. But it suggests that perhaps Zechariah was a young man when he did indeed return. And this may prove to be an interesting and useful point when we look at the next vision, and all will be revealed. It also tells us that Zechariah was in fact a Levite, because his father was listed among the Levites and priests. His grandfather, rather, was listed among the Levites and priests. So Zechariah was of the tribe of Levi, as many prophets were. In fact, the greatest prophet of all, John the Baptist, was a Levite too, and his father was called Zechariah, incidentally. One other thing perhaps worth mentioning is that the use of the myrtle tree. Again, I forgot to mention this in my last talk, but in the first vision that we looked at, this image of these angels gathering around this man on a horse, it all takes place under these myrtle trees. And the myrtle tree is a very important symbol in the Old Testament. It's particularly in the book of Isaiah, it's spoken of as a sign of God's restorative work in Israel and in Judah. So I think it's significant that the first vision takes place under a myrtle tree, and that is really the whole vision, the first vision, resonates with this idea of hope and promise and return. I forgot to mention that. So we're going to have a quick look at the second vision, and the second vision is cryptic, to say the least. But I think there is a straightforward interpretation, although people have lots of different interpretations, and you may disagree with mine. But I think there is a good reason to accept what my take on it is. The other interesting thing that happens when, or the first interesting thing perhaps worth mentioning when looking at the second vision, is that it takes place essentially in the same place as the first vision. Zechariah hasn't moved because he's actually asleep. We don't know, perhaps he was in his bed. But for the first 4 chapters, 3 full chapters with Zechariah is in a sort of sleep state when he's seeing the things that he's seeing. And it's not until Zechariah 4 verse 1 when he is woken up by the angel. You can look that up. And it actually says that he was awakened like someone wakened from sleep. So he was in some sort of dreamy vision state when he was seeing these things. And this is what he sees. Then I looked up, and there before me were 4 horns. I asked the angel who was speaking to me, "What are these?" He answered, "These are the horns that scatter Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem." Then the Lord showed me 4 craftsmen. I asked, "What are these coming to do?" He answered, "These are the horns that scattered Judah so that no one could raise their head. But the craftsmen have come to terrify them and throw down these horns of the nations who lifted up their horns against the land of Judah to scatter its people." So we're told in the very first instance that Zechariah looks up, and in the Hebrew it says he lifts up his eyes, and he sees this strange imagery of horns and craftsmen. In fact, the image of horns isn't that, it's strange, but it's not that unfamiliar to anyone reading the Old Testament and reading the prophets, and in particular in the book of Daniel, the imagery of horns is used a great deal. And in Daniel, they're always used to speak of rulers or leaders. And in fact, sometimes the horns have little crowns on them to speak of kings. And so whilst a lot of people interpret this passage as about being 4 kingdoms that scatter Israel and Judah, in fact, I believe that it's about 4 rulers, 4 individuals who have scattered Israel, Judah and Jerusalem. And I think the key to understand that passage is found by looking at the exiles that the Israelites had to suffer. And there were indeed 4 rulers. 3 of them were Neo-Assyrian rulers and 1 was a Neo-Babylonian ruler, but they all together scattered Israel, Judah and Jerusalem. The first one was Tiglath-Pileser III, who exiled the northern kingdom in 733. And the second was Sargon in 720, and he was also Neo-Assyrian. And then Esarhaddon, I believe there's evidence that he too was involved in exiling people in 670. He also exiled Manasseh, the king of Judah, in 670 and took him to Babylon. The final ruler, of course, is Nebuchadnezzar, who undertook 3 exiles, or led 3 exiles of the Judahites, and the final one being in 586 BC when the temple was burned to the ground and everyone had to leave Jerusalem. They were either killed or taken into exile. And the surprising thing that these 4 rulers have in common, and this is important, is that they were all, in fact, kings of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon, but in fact the Neo-Assyrian kings that I've mentioned, they were all also called the kings of Babylon, and Tiglath-Pileser III was the first Neo-Assyrian king to use that title. This idea of Babylonia and Babylon is obviously an important prophetic idea of, it's like the arch enemy of the Jewish people. And what we read of in this passage is that these horns have scattered Israel and they've scattered Judah, but God is sending what Zechariah describes as 4 craftsmen to scatter the horns. And of course, there's a little difficulty here with the tense of the passage, in that the 4 horns being described, I've suggested, they've already been and gone, and yet here we read that the craftsmen are coming to throw down these horns. And in fact, if you look at the Hebrew closely, and I think the NRSV translates it really well, it reads a bit more like this: these are the horns that scattered Judah, so that no head could be raised, but these have come to terrify them, to strike down the horns of the nations that lifted up their horns against the land of Judah, to scatter its people. So the suggestion is that it's the same nation to which the craftsmen are coming, or against which they're coming, but different horns, if you look at it carefully. And so it's going to be the future kings of Babylon that the craftsmen will raise up their head against. And this is perhaps best understood, and we have to understand a little bit of the history here in order to really get our heads around this. But very quickly, we know that the Jews prospered under the Persians, and the Persians treated the Jews favourably and sent them back to their own lands. But things were about to dramatically and unexpectedly change, as they so often do in history. And they changed when this guy called Alexander the Great, who I'm sure you've heard of, appears on the scene. And he really, his military campaign really changed the face of the world forever. And he wipes the Persians out. He sets up a new empire that stretched as far as India, and he made the centre of his kingdom Babylon. Surprise, surprise. And the problem with Alexander the Great was that he died very young. He was probably poisoned, to be honest. Nobody knows. And when he died, he had no sons that could take over the empire. So his kingdom was split into four different kingdoms or territories. And the book of Daniel, of course, explores this whole period of history. But what's interesting for us is that one of those kingdoms became the supreme kingdom, the dominant kingdom, the kingdom that basically defeated all the others, and that was the kingdom of the Seleucids. And they were the ones based in the north. They were based in what was Assyria and what was Babylon. And the Seleucids even took on the title of King of Babylon. And the thing about the Seleucids, what we learn from history, and particularly from some of the Seleucid kings, is that they were very anti-Jewish, and they oppressed the Jewish people, and they sought really to wipe them out and to wipe their religion out. And there was a king called Antiochus IV, that's well known, who began to persecute the Jewish people and began to forbid them to read the Torah, forbid them to worship in their temple. In fact, he put to death people that were caught with anything to do with the Jewish faith. And then, even more sacrilegiously, he sets up a temple, a statue in the temple, or probably of Zeus, and sacrifices pigs on the altar in the temple and desecrates the temple. These things are often talked about in relation to the end of all things, and the prophecies of Daniel in particular. But what actually happened is that in 167 BC, so we've jumped forward quite a few years, there was a priest called Matthias who basically refused to worship Greek gods, which is what they were being expected to do. And he leads a revolt against the Seleucids. And it's a really important revolt, and it's known as the Maccabean Revolt. And you can actually read all about this if you have a Bible with the Apocrypha in it, so a Catholic Bible, for example. There's a number of books in the middle called the Apocryphal books, and amongst those are these books called the Maccabees. And I think every Christian should read these. And although there are question marks over their authenticity as canon, nonetheless they are really fascinating historical books. And the books of Maccabees tell this story of this intertestamental period and this revolt of the Maccabees, because Matthias, who starts this revolt, as he was the first leader of the revolt, is succeeded by his son called Judas, who became known as Judas Maccabeus. And in fact, after Judas dies, his two other brothers become leaders of the movement, and they fought against the Seleucids. And of course, Maccabeus means hammer, and that was the name that all of those leaders went by, the Maccabees. My feeling is that these are the craftsmen that Zechariah is referring to, those that would lead the revolt against the horns, against what was the king of Babylon, and the power of the Seleucid Empire. Of course, those events are very important. They're very deep-rooted in the history of the Jewish people, because Judas Maccabeus and the revolt against the Seleucids ended up with the restoration or the rededication of the temple, and the Seleucids were thrown out, and Judah became an independent state under the Hasmoneans for over 100 years. So it was like an amazing time where Judah fought back. They'd been oppressed for so long. They'd been crushed for so long, they'd been exiled, and here now, in Zechariah's future, he was speaking of a time when they would lift up their heads and they would fight back against the horns that had historically always oppressed them. And in the midst of that is this wonderful picture of worship being restored to the temple, and the whole celebration of Hanukkah is, of course, caught up in those events of that story. So it's worth checking out, it's worth reading, particularly 1 Maccabees is really worth a read. So there we are. I think that's what the second vision is all about. I believe Zechariah is seeing something in his future. He is seeing something that is going to happen to the people of Judah in the future. And he is again speaking hope and promise and something wonderful about his people's future, that they won't always be oppressed, but a time will be coming when they can throw off the yoke of slavery. And in fact, if you look at the Hebrew in Zechariah, the second vision, it talks of the craftsman casting out the horns. And in fact, that's really what happens. They really did expel the enemy forces from their land and establish their kingdom. So I hope that's helpful. I realise it's complicated in its history, but nonetheless, I think without that, we can't really understand what on earth these chapters are about. Next time, we're going to look at the third vision of Zechariah, which is really exciting, and I think you'll love. So thanks for watching. God bless, and see you soon.